It's important to always pick the right deck for each format, but sometimes that can be tricky. So let's talk about it. Hey everyone, welcome back to Toasty TCG. In today's video, I'll be discussing the March 2021 competitive landscape and where I feel decks fall into the current metagame. But before we get started, I just want to add that this video is a direct sequel to my previous video about this format's best side deck choices. So if you enjoyed this video, definitely check out that one, and with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Alright, welcome to my totally normal tier list template. To start off, we've got Brigade. What makes this deck so good is its access to all the really good generic Beast, Beast Warrior, and Wing Beast support out there. This gives the deck a lot of powerful starters like Rescue Cat and Obedient Schooled, but it can also be combined with other archetypes like Melfi and Lyrilisc for even more extenders and unique lines of play. What makes this deck especially strong is it can consistently establish a Wind Barrier statue lock on turn 1, and that can be game over for almost any deck right now. I feel what holds the deck back though is monster removal prevents access to a lot of its link monsters. Artifact Lancia can really cripple the deck, and other combos are just more resilient. So for those reasons, I'll have to be putting this deck into tier 2. Next up, we've got Phantom Knights. This deck is loads of extenders and different lines of play to achieve a variety of different boards. That variety can really throw off opponents who don't know every end board the deck can make, or where to stop those lines of play. Unfortunately though, it struggles against things like Lancia, Nibiru, and Super Poly, and also a wide variety of floodgates. On the upside though, in response to those things, it can usually make a Verde Anaconda, which means a Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, so it's not completely dead in the water in those situations. And for that reason, I'm going to give this deck a spot in tier 2. Following the previous ban list, we saw the new Morale engine really fall off, but some players have still managed to find success with it as a go-second OTK deck. Numeron has a really unique OTK potential, and players will normally not think to play around it in Game 1, often not summoning their monsters in defense, which will cost them a game. But in Game 2 and 3, it will be much more difficult for the Numeron player, with their opponent now thinking to play around the Numeron OTK. This deck also really struggles to achieve its win condition against floodgates, monster removal, and effect negation. That's why I have to put this deck at the bottom of the barrel. Hope you've enjoyed all the thumbnails I've chosen to represent each deck so far. Let me know what your favorite one is down in the comments below. So moving on, we've got Eldritch. This deck has been around for almost a year in and out of the format. While right now I feel like it struggles against the other biggest contenders of the format, it has some amazing strengths and often doesn't show its full potential until that second engine of the deck is revealed. And that second engine can be a very wide variety of different engines. Things such as Zoodiac, Dogmatica, and Invoked. So it can be tough to interact with it if you don't know what that second engine is in the Eldritch player's deck. It also boasts a very high consistency, interactive, and versatile interruptions, and probably the best grind game potential of the format. So for those reasons, this deck is clearly going straight to the top. Let's move on to Dogmatica. This deck is in a really weird spot right now, if you can even call it a deck. It's more of an engine for other decks like Invoked, Zoodiac, Shaddoll, and Eldritch. Its main function varies based on the deck it's being played with. For example, Eldritch. It can be used for additional monster removal provided by Punishment, Maximus, and Nadir Servant, which all can be used to send Entis to destroy any card and perform their other function. With Invoked, it's more of the same, except all those plays get protected by a Mechaba, and having a negate with Fleur for the opponent's turn, and on top of those two things, it can either set the punishment, or you can hold it for Mechaba fodder against things like Evenly Matched. Now for Zoodiac, it grants more back row setup, and backs up the Trident with a Fleur de Lis, and finally Shaddoll essentially can run it for all those same benefits as the other decks do. But on top of that, all the Shaddoll fusion monsters all have something useful that they do when they get sent to the graveyard. So the cherry on top for all these decks is Nadir's Servant can lead to summoning a Winda on the opponent's turn through Shadal's Schism. This is a really solid engine, but it's usually the weaker engine among whichever other engines you combine it with, and Maximus can be advantageous for the opponent with the right deck, or someone who may have built their extra deck with Maximus in mind, which leads some people to just not use Maximus at all. So while this engine isn't meta-defining, it's still used in a lot of meta decks, so for that reason, we're going to be putting it right in tier 1.5. If you haven't guessed it already, based on the thumbnail, it's obviously Guru Stun up next. This is the big monkey flip deck of the format, depending more on generic back row than the actual archetype, with cards like There Can Only Be One, Soulm Strike and Soulm Judgment, and any other floodgate the deck can abuse. The main gimmick that has brought this deck back into the game recently is that it can play 3 Red Eyes Fusion because it doesn't need to normal or special summon. Instead, it often opts to set a Subterra Guru and probably flip it with Hidden City in the same turn. Now, while I can drag this deck through the mud all day, its main issue is its dependency on Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, meaning that if it can't make Dragoon, then you're simply playing a relatively weak stun deck while you're trying to hold off a much more resilient deck, and you just have to hope that Pot of Prosperity or Pot of Extravagance can help save you. And if the deck doesn't do that, it's usually just one Lightning Storm or evenly matched away from a loss. So for those reasons, I have to put this deck down to tier 2. Before I continue, if you enjoy this kind of content and want to help support the channel, consider subscribing. It's extremely appreciated and vital to the channel's growth. But moving on, we've got Zoodiac. This is one of my favorite thumbnails I got to choose because it has all the Zoodiac XC except for Banned Bull. This deck is full of one-card starters and interactive back row that helps it control the pace of the game. It can even fit in some floodgates of its own. While those things actually aren't enough to make a deck viable, its easy access to Zeus is. One direct attack from Borbo can often lead to a board wipe that's especially good against combo decks, since Zeus isn't once per turn, and it can force every negate on the board in one turn in a single chain. Where it struggles though is monster removal can often leave this deck wide open with its heavy resilience on monsters XZ summon, and it can oftentimes be very crippled even by back row hate. So for those reasons, I really can't put this deck at much more than tier 2. Up next, we've got Shadal's. This deck has been in and out of the meta a lot since the start of the last year, but right now is a really good time for the deck when mixed with Invoked and even a small Dogmatica engine. 2 to 3 super consistent engines full of +1 card effects, and Graveyard Recursion is insane. On top of that, it can heavily abuse cards like Shadal's Schism, Super Polymerization, and just gets so much value out of Magical Meltdown's continuous effect. This deck's ability to grind is directly on par with Eldritch, and has the tools to shut down Dragonlink completely. The main issue that this deck has isn't really even enough to hold the deck back sometimes, those being things like Floodgates, Drool and Lockbird, and Artifact Lancia. Considering how I only have good things to say about this deck, it's going right to the top. So moving on, we've got Virtual World. This deck fell off hard after King of Coal Calamities got the axe, but the deck's technically still at full power, with every card still being at 3. It still has access to all of its power cards like Shen Shen, Chuche, and has even added Ultimate to Zolkin into its fold to make Crystal Wing. The deck has a lot of cards to get back resources from the graveyard and banished, regardless of if the card is banished face up or face down. It can go +1 or even +2 at some times. The deck's main issue though is basic interruptions like Ash Blossom, Cosmic Cyclone, or Soulm Strike that are only minor inconveniences for other decks can oftentimes cripple the deck's entire turn, and a well-timed Nibiru can really hurt. That's why I've got to put this deck at tier 2 at best. Alright, let's move on to Invoked. This deck has a similar case to Dogmatica, except it generates a more long-term value, with cards like Invocation and Magical Meltdown. Invocation, of course, recurring Alistair for follow-up plays every single turn. This deck can be played in tandem with Eldritch, Dogmatica, and the big one, of course, being Shadal's, to very great effect. However, when I said Shadal's main exploits are Lancia and Drool Lock, the Invoked engine is the reason why. Apart from being susceptible to Ash Blossom and other negates against Alistair, this engine is still really strong, which is why it's going to get a 1.5 from me. Moving on is a bit of a wild card in the form of Buster Blader. This is seeing a lot of play right now because it hard counters Dragon Link, setting up a board that prevents your opponent from using their monster effects through Prologue of the Destruction Swordsman by itself. It can play a small Dogmatica engine and a Dragoon engine, and most people will lack the knowledge of how to play against it and not know to stop the deck from getting to Prologue in the first place. The deck's heavy back row reliance and matchup dependency can hold the deck back, however, and a more seasoned player will know what to look out for to counter it. On top of that, it plays a couple of bricky cards which can slow it down, and that's what keeps this deck at the bottom of the barrel, unfortunately. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you know I had to include Thunder Dragons. While unfortunately we didn't get back Colossus, this deck is still going pretty strong with several variants and a lot of powerful starters like Batteryman Solar, Aloof Lupine, and Chaos Space, depending on the variant that you choose to go with. Every variant can make some really good boards off these starters and be super disruptive on the opponent's turn. The problem, however, is that this deck's problems nearly outweigh the benefits. It struggles against nearly any kind of disruption, especially the higher impact ones like Nibiru, Lancia, and Dark Ruler No More. Now, as much as I love this deck, and I really want to be biased about it, I've got to send this deck to the bottom of the barrel for now. Moving right along, we've got Medolce. This deck is full to the brim with effects that net +1 or even +2 advantages. While in the past it could really only go second, it can now make some really good going first boards. If it's allowed to go off, it will constantly build momentum and channel its inner going second deck on its next turn to OTK without a problem. But speaking of problems, this deck is stopped by very simple interruptions, board wipes, and it really struggles to recover once it's stopped and it's staring down an opponent's established board. For those reasons, this is another deck for the bottom. On the other side of things, we've got Dinosaurs. This deck has been a menace for some time, and that hasn't changed this format. This deck is full of starters. Through Miscellaneousaur, it has a blanket protection for all dinosaurs it summons during the phase, and it can easily go in for the kill against most decks. It especially excels against decks like Dragon Link that are combo based, oftentimes plowing through boards while OTKing in the same turn. This deck is what all those other OTK based decks want to be. It has better consistency, better starters, better board wipes, Papa Johns. This deck is very good. Where it falls short, though, is that it can be very dependent on Miscellaneousaur's graveyard effect. So things that banish Miscellaneousaur, negate Miscellaneousaur, or prevent banishing can be extremely detrimental to the deck. So while the deck has way more pros than it has cons, Tier 1 is just a little bit out of this deck's reach this format. Up next are Prank Kids. This is another sleeper deck that has made some waves this format. With all of its main deck monsters being +1s, it can generate a lot of advantage. It grinds really well, and it can be very good at controlling the game state through cards like Battle Butler. It's especially good in Tournament, where time can come in really clutch for this deck more than other decks. Now, where it falls short, though, is its reliance on the new Link 1 can be a bit of a curse if that monster that was used to summon the Link 1 gets ashed. It can also struggle to survive board wipes, and will often just simply lose to better decks that can grind better, or do what Prank Kids does, just better. For those reasons, I have to put this card at the bottom of tier 1.5, kind of like as the gatekeeper. For the next deck, I decided to respect its player base and not choose a meme card to represent it, which is why I've picked Dante to represent Burning Abyss. Everyone loves Dante. Burning Abyss is back at full power, and it can play in a variety of different ways, whether it be a back row heavy control deck, an all-in combo deck, or a more mid-range control deck. This deck has options, and they can all lead to very big explosive OTK finishers. But where this deck lacks, though, is no matter which choice you go with, you're simply playing a worse version of a better deck. See, you want back row, you got Eldritch. You want control, you've got Shaddolls. You want combo, you've got Dragon Link. Now, I know that statement can be said about pretty much every deck that isn't meta, but most of the other decks that are competitive right now, they do something unique to itself, or something unique to just a few other decks. Burning Abyss just feels very lackluster and severely outclassed by the other options right now, which is why I really just have to put this deck to the bottom of the barrel. Next up, we've got the deck with the biggest target on its back this format, Dragonlink. This deck is second to nothing right now, with an endless array of extenders, insanely oppressive end boards, the versatility of multiple combo routes to reach its goals, and the power to push through other decks going second without a problem. This deck warrants main deck hate like Drool and Lockbird, Lancia, Nibiru, Super Polymerization, and Floodgates to stop it from putting your deck through the blender. Its only problem is the fact that people will main deck hate cards in an effort to stop it, but sometimes those efforts aren't even close to enough to matter. This deck is at the top of tier 1, no questions asked. Finally is the true deck that doesn't get a meme thumbnail, because I don't think people recognize it if they aren't actually playing it. That being the super underrated Earth Machine deck. This deck feels like a modern day style Mangrate, doing nothing too unfair or too oppressive. It recurs a lot of resources, sets up a lot of disruptions, but except unlike Salad, it uses big guns to OTK the opponents. And those OTKs are regardless of whether it's going first and just stopping the opponent from making plays through multiple disruptions like detaching Dare Crane, its numerous back row that it can get from drawing several cards through card effects, or simply its built-in abilities to go second in OTK. I feel like this deck is severely underrated as it only really has trouble against Nibiru and a handful of back row. So this is a rare occasion where it feels like this deck is tier 2, but only because of lack of representation. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video, but if you feel like I missed a deck or disagree with where I placed a deck, let me know in the comments, or by joining the Discord server, which is linked in the description along with the Facebook page and the TCG Player affiliate link, which you can use to directly support the channel by using it when you get cards you were buying anyway. With that all out of the way, this is going to be Toasty TCG signing out.